So with that, I call Elliot Colburn from Carshalton and Wellington, who's virtual, to propose the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 300976, entitled Make LGBT Conversion Therapy Illegal in the UK. The prayer of this petition states, and I quote, that I would like the government to make running conversion therapy in the UK a criminal offence, forcing people to attend said conversion therapies a criminal offence, sending people abroad in order to try and convert them a criminal offence, and protect individuals from conversion therapy. Despite all major counselling and psychotherapy bodies in the UK, including the NHS, condemning LGBT conversion therapy, it is still legal, and LGBT individuals in the UK are still exposed to this psychological and emotional abuse to this day. The very thought of this sickens me, and I would like to see it stopped one day. The petition, when it closed, had 256,392 signatures, including 487 from my own Carshalton and Wellington constituency. Mr. Gray, there are a few moments that I can think of as being so humbling as to be opening this important debate today. And I think it's testament to the importance of this issue that it was heavily oversubscribed. And I know many colleagues who wanted to get in couldn't. And I just want to briefly say thanks and acknowledge from my side of the House the campaigning done by my honourable friends, the members for Darlington, Bracknell, Aylesbury, Redcar, Watford, South Ribble, High Peak, Bishop Auckland, Bury South, Burnley and others. And in preparation for today's debate and throughout my campaigning on this issue since being elected as an MP, it has been my absolute honour to speak to campaign and charitable organisations, experts from the fields of health, religion, education, law and beyond, legislators from across the world, including Malta, Canada, Australia, Spain and New Zealand, where these practices have either already been banned or are in the process of doing so. But most importantly, I'm grateful to the survivors for speaking out and sharing their stories. Their bravery in shining a light on these abhorrent practices will help save countless lives in the future if we can secure this ban. But first, we must ask ourselves, what is conversion therapy and why does it need to be banned? According to a May 2020 report by the UN Office for Human Rights, and indeed by a definition from the GEO, so-called conversion therapy is an umbrella term used to describe interventions of a wide-ranging nature, all of which have in common the belief that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can and should be changed. These so-called therapies can manifest in many forms, from pseudo-psychological treatments and aversion therapies to practices that are religiously based, such as purification or fasting. At its most extreme, there's been evidence that this can also involve physical and sexual violence, including so-called corrective rape. I want to share just some of the stories of the survivors that have bravely shared their stories with me and the world in an attempt to help campaign for the end of this practice in the UK. The first is Joe's story. As a boy, Joe was grappling with his hidden gay identity. Before leaving for his year in Yeshiva in Israel, a highly significant moment for many young Jews, he sought out conversion therapy and began weekly phone calls with a so-called therapist. After a year, this had clearly not worked and instead sought in-person therapies, where a group leader would force them to process moments of homosexual attraction, only for them to then be scrutinised, judged and shamed, leaving Joe with an immense sense of depression. Thankfully, after hearing other Orthodox gay Jews speak out about their own experience, he stopped his conversion therapy, but the experience has left a scar to this day. Next is Josh's story. Josh went undercover in a Liverpool church in 2017 for the Liverpool Echo, which offered a cure for homosexuality through a 3-day starvation programme. The assistant pastor told Josh to starve himself and not drink any water before taking part in weekly prayer sessions, referring to being gay as the deceit of Satan. In these prayer groups, it was said that the assistant pastor would shout phrases such as "kill it with fire," "die in the fire," whilst members of the congregation were seen crying, shaking and sweating and apparently appearing to speak in tongues. What is also shocking is that the assistant pastor was at the time, and I can find no evidence to the contrary that he is no longer, a doctor within the NHS. Finally, I want to talk about Carolyn. At 17, Carolyn confided in her local vicar her feelings of self-hatred and depression and suicidal thoughts because she did not feel like a boy. Her vicar took her to a doctor in a psychiatric hospital where Carolyn was strapped to a wooden chair in a dark room, and as images of women's clothing were projected onto the wall in front of her, the doctors would deliver a painful electric shock, hoping to associate the feelings of being a woman with memories of intense pain. And like Joe and Josh, this experience remains with Carolyn to this day. Joe, Josh and Carolyn are just 3 survivors that I've had the privilege of speaking to who have experienced a wide range of these so-called conversion therapies, and I want to commend them for their bravery in speaking out, sharing their story and campaigning to end these practices in the UK. And indeed, sadly, they are just 3 of many. The government's first ever national LGBT survey in 2018 of over 108,000 LGBT people in Britain found that 7% of respondents had either undergone or been offered conversion therapy. 13% of trans respondents had undergone or been offered conversion therapy. Of those who had, 51% said that this was conducted by faith groups, and a further 19% said that this was done by healthcare providers or medical professionals. However, as the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition has outlined, given the clandestine and deceptive way these so-called conversion therapies are offered, giving them different names or dressing them up as alternative treatments, etc., the real number is likely to be a lot higher. And tragically, we will never hear the testimonies of so many who felt grappling with their own identity whilst also being told how wrong they were through these therapies, left them feeling with no other option than to take their own life. This is also an important point. We're not here talking about harmful practices that occurred some time ago. This is happening today, right here in the UK, right now. The UN report into conversion therapy last year summed it up perfectly when it concluded that any and all forms of conversion therapy are inherently degrading and discriminatory. They're rooted in the belief that LGBT persons are somehow inferior, and they must at any cost modify their orientation or identity to remedy that supposed inferiority. Indeed, so strong was this report that it called for nothing less than a global ban on conversion therapy. And here in the UK, the practice has received almost universal condemnation. In 2017, a Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy in the UK was signed by NHS England and 12 other psychotherapy and health bodies, charities and organisations. And I want to thank Iggy Moon for their time in speaking to me about the impact this has had. In another very powerful intervention, the Church of England in 2017 also passed a motion condemning these practices and calling on the government to ban it, a call that has now been echoed by over 370 global religious leaders and organisations. And I want to pay particular tribute to Jane Ozanne and her foundation for her leadership, her courage and her tireless efforts in campaigning on this issue. And finally, in the National LGBT Action Plan of 2018, the UK government committed to bring forward proposals to ban conversion therapy, something which has been echoed many times in the House since that commitment was made. So we have the agreement, we have the commitment, and we have a coalition of voices from all parts of society urging this ban to be brought forward. But what we need now is the action. Because with every day that passes, there is another person at risk of being subject to this degrading treatment, and we risk losing even more lives for people who feel there is no other way out. And these are the final 2 points I want to raise today. First of all is what this ban must include. The government doesn't need to start from scratch, as highly praised examples already exist in places like Madrid, Malta, and Victoria in Australia. Learning from these examples and in line with the UN report's recommendations, this ban must cover both the public and the private spheres, all forms of intervention, no matter what they may be, whether that be healthcare, religious, cultural, traditional, etc. It must cover both children and adults, cover both those that have been coerced and indeed those that consented to these conversion practices. An up-to-date definition of advertising to ensure that it encompasses both public, private, community spaces and online advertising. The sending or the threatening to send someone overseas to undergo so-called conversion therapies, establishing a punishment framework for non-compliance and investigative frameworks, creating mechanisms for support and redress to victims, And finally, it must truly protect all LGBT plus people. This cannot just be a gay conversion therapy ban, but cover degrading and inhumane interventions aimed at changing anyone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. We must remember that this is about the practice themselves and about the fact that absolutely no one should be subject to these abhorrent interventions. And to avoid confusion and protect those delivering real support and actual support for LGBT plus people, laws passed elsewhere in the world have introduced specific mention of what should not be considered as part of their bans, including safe and supportive therapies. But finally is also the need for a timeline. We have a commitment, we have evidence, we have international working examples. So what we need now is a bill. And I appreciate that the government has been gathering evidence and looking to better understand this and explore options. But I hope that the Minister will be able to deliver some good news today and tell us when a bill will be published so that we can debate it on the floor of the House. To conclude, Mr. Gray, the evidence is clear. So-called conversion therapy doesn't work. There's no scientific basis for it whatsoever. And parts of every section of UK society have come together, united in their condemnation and calling for it to be banned. 2021 looks like a year of restarting, of reopening, of regrowing. So let's add to that positivity by getting a conversion therapy ban onto the statute books this year. And I'd like to end by saying that as a gay man myself, and on behalf of LGBT plus people in the UK and around the world, we are here, our existence is real, our lives are valid, and we cannot and do not need to be cured. Thank you.
The question is, this House has considered e-petition order. The question is, this House considered the e-petition 300976 relating to LGBT conversion therapy. It may help the House to know that some 50 people put in originally to speak in this debate, of which the Mr. Speaker has selected 20. If they are to achieve that number, then I'd suggest that, courtesy to each other, a maximum of 3 minutes, perhaps 2 minutes would be even better. And with that, we go to Oakhill and South Perthshire, John Nicholson.